The hour for the reconvening of the Water Quality Management Committee having arrived, we'll call the meeting to order. Let me introduce the committee quickly. We have Tom Duncan, longtime member, Jordan Mora, very useful member, Ken Foreman, never on time member.
Here today.
You did. Matt Charette.
Thank you for moving the time to 4:30.
We told him it was 4 o'clock, so he'd get here in time. And Steve Layton, who was a longtime member. John, who was a member, John Waterbury, and is now on the Board of Health. Amy Lowell, the wastewater superintendent for the town of Falmouth. Ed Sintero, the new finance person for the town of Falmouth. Steve Morse, citizen, someone from the enterprise here, and not to be last but not least, but Nancy Taylor, the chairman of the Board of Selectmen, is joining us today. So we have a detailed and concerning presentation that it'll be of some length. We're certainly welcome to jump in with questions at any time, but it's a lot to cover, because what we're looking at here is something that the state has sort of foisted upon us, as it were. They're not finished with their process, but if what they're proposing comes out in any way similar to the way they're proposing it, we are all going to have to face up to a lot of fiscal mountains, frankly, coming ahead. Also joined by our interim acting town manager, Peter Johnson-Staub, and Selectman Brown, our longtime former liaison. But thank you for coming. As usual, the work on this has mostly all been done by our consultant, Kristen, and so she's going to walk us through this. As we say, she will provide the facts and figures, and I will provide the blah blah. And as you say, anyone who has any questions along the line, please ask them.
So we are being live broadcast by FCTV, so if you do have questions, you need to come to a microphone. That was their rule.
Okay.
So you can interrupt me.
To the microphone and not walking around?
Well, if it's in the middle of when I'm talking, I'm not walking.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I can only do so many things at once, Eric.
I didn't know that.
All right. So the main focus of today is basically comparing the Falmouth Estuary Restoration Plan for all of the estuaries in town and looking at it compared with the DEP's proposed watershed permit plan. So this is just kind of the quick snapshot of the highlights of what each plan is trying to accomplish. Falmouth, the Water Quality Management Committee decided a long, long time ago that they were going to address one estuary at a time. They were going to look at the estuaries that were the most impacted, that had the highest nitrogen load that needed to be removed first. Then, on the South Coast estuaries, proceed from west to east, then move to the Buzzards Bay estuaries because those have such a low nitrogen removal requirement. They also decided that they were only going to borrow money at debt drop-off windows to avoid property tax increases. With the DEP proposed watershed permit plan, the DEP would appreciate if we addressed all 14 of our estuaries at once. Address all 14 estuaries at once within 20 years. That's their maximum timetable. If you are involved in a DEP watershed permit, that is an enforceable action, so they have a lot of rights over you as the permittee. In order to accomplish that timetable, the town would need to increase taxes to be able to fund the initiatives to meet that timetable. So we've talked previously about the Pleasant Bay watershed permit. This is the only watershed permit that's currently in existence, so it's the only one we have to model off of. At the DEP proposed requirements of what it would take to get a watershed permit and what that might mean for the town. But just to take a little bit of a look at the language that's actually written into the permit itself to show you what kind of control the DEP has over it. Basically saying that the activities are all enforceable requirements and you have to comply with it or it's enforceable actions. The DEP can modify, revoke, reissue the permit if they find you to be in non-compliance with it.
For those who don't know, the Pleasant Bay watershed involves one watershed and 4 towns. What we have here, of course, is 1 town and 14 watersheds, so it's a very different situation. But as Kristen says, they are the only model we have, so we're working with it.
So some more of the specifics from the permit. It basically says that you can go ahead and use your non-traditional approaches if they're implemented and maintained as laid out in the permit. But if at any point the DEP decides that they're not working effectively, they reserve the right to require you to implement proven technologies, basically at any point. The proven technology, previously it was called the traditional plan, which is sewering. Targeted water, always backup, which again is the sewering option, basically to say if the alternatives don't do what they're planned to do, your backup plan is sewering. So this, be it hard to see, is the actual implementation schedule for the Pleasant Bay watershed permit. So you have the 4 towns, you have Brewster, Chatham, Harwich, and Orleans. The way the 20-year permit is divided, it's in 4 phases, so 5 years each. So this basically outlines what each town is responsible for during which phase of the permit. So you can see the majority of the nitrogen reduction is going to be, in theory, occurring in phase 2 and phase 3. And a lot of that is attributed to the sewers for Orleans, Harwich, and Chatham.
One of the leaders from Orleans was on a radio show with Steve a couple of weeks ago, and he was sort of saying, well, we've accomplished 80% of what we were supposed to accomplish in our first 5 years. I said, well, that's terrific, but most of that was pretty light stuff. You know, it wasn't sewering by and large. It was a lot of planning and such, so it wasn't hard to get to 80%. But
Right. The total for Orleans in that first phase was only 273 kilograms and was mostly aquaculture.
Yep.
So this is just kind of the Pleasant Bay watershed permit broken down by general categories. So what their nitrogen removal for fertilizer, their fertilizer bylaw. The town of Brewster has a lot of specific work with their municipal golf course, so that's why it's a separate golf course fertilizer. Aquaculture, IA systems, and sewering. So the Pleasant Bay watershed has about 18,000 kilograms that need to be removed. So they're banking on 62% of that removal coming from sewering. Falmouth estuaries. So next we're going to go into the plan, kind of what water quality has been developing for the last 10 years, how that fits into the scenarios. Did you want to interject yet? Okay. So over the last 10 years, water quality has been developing scenarios either formally for the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan, the CWMP, or informally for some of the other watersheds that have not had a formal plan submitted, so the Buzzards Bay estuaries. And all of these plans include a combination of sewering and alternatives and whatever's practical for those watersheds. So the scenarios have all been developed to address the present watershed load reductions that are defined in the MEP. So the present loads were, when the MEPs were done 10 to 15 years ago, the data that was obtained before that, and what those current conditions were, how to get your threshold concentration at the Sentinel station. So there are build-out numbers baked into the MEP, but build-out is a moving target as land use changes and different projects come up. To address build-out would require additional nitrogen reduction scenarios. So all of our scenarios address the present load, and that's what's been approved by EPA in the TMDL approvals. So this is the bar graph that you guys see in most presentations. These are the total amount of nitrogen that needs to be removed by estuary according to the MEP. So the grand total for this is just shy of 43,000 kilograms of nitrogen that need to be removed townwide. So we have a little asterisk up here because West Falmouth Harbor is a special case in that while the MEP was being developed, upgrades for the treatment plant were happening. And as a result, the MEP shows that there's about 8,800 kilograms that need to be removed. But the upgrades to the treatment plant and the changes to the discharge basically negated that. So most of that has already been taken out and accounted for, but we'll look at that separately. So there was more, it's been better.
Okay. Before you run into each estuary here, I just want to describe what you're about to see here. We're calling it the bookend concept, and basically what we thought was, let's sort of get our best case and our worst case and see what they look like in terms of what they cost the town to do, essentially. So the best case, in our humble opinion, is the one the committee and the town have been working with and for the last 10 years, which involves a fair amount of alternatives and minimum amount of sewering. The worst case in this scenario is going to be if the DEP, as is its right and inclination, says your alternatives aren't really going to pan out, sewering is your option, and here's how much sewering would be involved if we had to follow that scenario. So you're going to see two scenarios for every estuary. The Falmouth one with as many alternatives as we think are feasible, and the DEP one, worst case scenario, where they would say the alternatives aren't going to work. Here's how much sewering you have to do to get to where we want you to go.
All right, so kind of some generalities for all of these. We're gonna go through each estuary, hopefully quickly. The point of this is not to get into the weeds on any estuary. We can do that at a future meeting. Every scenario is going to have the nitrogen heat map that comes from the MEP reports. So for people not familiar with it, your warmer colors means that there's a higher nitrogen concentration in that portion of the estuary. Your cooler colors means a lower concentration. What you want to see is lower concentrations. For all of the scenarios, for any time IAs are put out there, I did the IA calculations the same way we've been doing for the last year, using average water flow, using the state effluent number of 35 milligrams per liter, even though we all think differently about that, and IAs performing at 6 milligrams per liter. So this is consistent with when we looked at the 300-foot boundary scenario, when we've looked at a lot of other things. The shellfish numbers that are presented for any of these are the most recent numbers that were just presented by Chuck at the last meeting. So these have been updated according to the amount of acreage that was determined based on those surveys and the use for each of those areas. So it's not just an oyster number, depending what estuary you're in. So Megansett is one of the two estuaries that's shared. There has not been a formal allocation of nitrogen for this. So the best we can go off of is that the Cape Cod Commission proposes that Falmouth is responsible for 61% of the nitrogen load. So 61% of that gets you to 894 kilograms. So you have the standard fertilizer and stormwater credit, the 25% reduction because we have a fertilizer bylaw in place, and the stormwater 25% credit because we follow the NEPDs and the MS4 permit requirements. Something that hasn't been presented to the committee previously is an IA at the Royal Megansett Nursing Home. When John Waterbury started to look at the 300-foot boundary in Megansett, it was a very small handful of homes down here out in the main basin where nitrogen really wasn't that much of an issue. When we were looking at the scenarios, Royal Megansett Nursing Home is one of the largest contributors, so looking at the water use, and if we turn to put an IA in there, that has the potential to reduce about 338 kilograms of nitrogen. And then with Chuck's shellfish number, we get to and above the target using the alternatives. If we just use the fertilizer and the stormwater credit, because that's something we wanted to keep as far as the bookend, it's debatable. We've heard that they're going to accept that. To make up the difference with sewering, it would require 133 parcels for Megansett. Rand's Canal, 607 kilograms to remove. Rand's Canal is tricky because there's 2 forks to it. Looking at the Falmouth scenario, we've got the fertilizer, the stormwater, and then the 300-foot boundary identified 23 potential IA lots. That doesn't get you to where you need, even with the shellfish. There's been talks of different locations for a PRB, whether, down along the road down here might catch it, over here might catch it. Nothing has come up as suitable, and there's been no evaluation to even pretend to know what kind of nitrogen removal you might expect from that. So that's why it's a question mark. So to get to 100%, you'd need to add a bunch more IAs. Again, at 6 milligrams per liter, you'd need 71 of those. To do it on the DEP watershed permit scenario, you'd have to sewer 86 parcels within that watershed. Fiddler's Cove was one of the watersheds that was identified as being able to meet the TMDL. Yes, Ken, in the microphone, please.
So all of these are different distances from our centralized treatment plant. I'm just wondering if there's been any thought about relative cost per house, if you have to run a main.
That's a whole different can of worms, and we can, when we start getting into costs, we'll talk about the
Okay.
caveats with all of that. Don't get ahead of me.
Sorry.
So Fiddler's Cove was one of the estuaries that was identified as being able to meet the TMDL using what's in the 300-foot boundary. So 58 units at 6 milligrams would get you there. If you had a sewer, it would only be 43 parcels. Wild Harbor has a fairly high nitrogen reduction requirement as far as the Buzzards Bay estuaries go. It's got 2,700 kilograms that need to be removed. There is a separate category for golf course fertilizer credit. Because of the bylaw and what I'm told, some fertilizer practice changes at Valley Mead Golf Course, that gets its own category. We also have a category that was baked into the MEP for the new Silver Beach wastewater treatment facility when that was put in for that area, because that was happening around the same time the MEP was being done. For Wild Harbor, for how densely populated, how densely developed it is, and the existing sewer line, to put IAs in there was going to be at least 300 IAs. So Eric and I discussed quite a bit, and the most logical sense would be the potential for a sewer expansion off the new Silver Beach. The way the estuary is, all of this up here has already been sewered as part of new Silver Beach, and the Sentinel station is actually up in here. But as you can see from the heat map, this is the impaired section down here. And then there's some shellfish as well that Chuck identified there. If you're just sewering alone, you'd require over 300 parcels. So West Falmouth, I briefly alluded to it on the bar graph. By the MEP number, there's about 8,800 kilograms that need to be removed. So the fertilizer and the stormwater credit, that's pretty much what makes up what's still on that bar. GHD, once those upgrades to the treatment and discharge were made, GHD calculated that it's actually an 8,792 kilogram removal. So in theory, on paper, you've already met it. We already have the IA demonstration project in West Falmouth that was partners with Buzzards Bay Coalition. So when I did the calculations based on water use and the number of parcels, the same way I do everything else, I came up with those units, potentially 81 kilograms removal. Looking at the actual Buzzards Bay data, because they're measuring influent and effluent, and they have much higher influence, they had almost 300 kilograms of removal from those IAs. So that's a range, but it's not even anything we need to count, but I'm just presenting it because it's a different. Chuck also has a ton of shellfish that could go in there. Again, not needed to meet the TMDL, but certainly won't hurt water quality. Again, on paper, we've met it, so there's no additional sewering that would need to happen over there. Quistit Harbor has a very low nitrogen reduction. Between the shellfish and using a portion of the homes within the 300-foot boundary, 22 of them, you could easily meet the TMDL. If you were to sewer it would only require 30 parcels. Oyster Pond has the draft CWMP that's been done, so a lot of work has been done on that. I've done a lot of work comparing IA performance level and whether you could do that to IAs in the watershed and meet your TMDL. And basically what we came up with was you can't with IAs even performing at 6 milligrams per liter. So the general consensus is that it's going to be sewered. And the numbers from Wright Pierce for the scenario that they developed were 189 dwelling units to get connected with a removal of 1,280 kilograms, so that gets you to your TMDL. So these two scenarios are the same. Salt Pond is a special one. The town completed a Massachusetts Estuaries Project report that identified the estuary as being impaired and that it needs a reduction of 1,200 kilograms of nitrogen per year. Salt Pond does not appear on the state's impaired waters list, and it does not have an EPA-approved TMDL at this time. So there has not been any formal planning that has been done for it, but there's a note in the MEP that basically says even if you remove 100% of the septic load, you can't meet the TMDL, basically because of poor circulation and inadequate flushing. So that's an estuary that's going to take some extra planning efforts, but it's not a mandated one at this point. Falmouth Harbor has a fairly low nitrogen reduction requirement. So looking at Falmouth Harbor, there's already existing sewer that comes partway down Scranton Avenue as part of Main Street. So one of the simplest would be to extend the sewer. This parcel right here is the Falmouth Housing Corporation Authority. That is not connected to sewer, and there's several properties over here that are multi-unit condos. So between the shellfish and the sewer, some of those parcels, it would only take 24 parcels to connect to meet the TMDL. If you're doing it by sewer alone, you'd need almost twice that. Little Pond, like West Falmouth, is one that on paper is checked off as being met. Between the fertilizer credit, the stormwater credit, and what GHD has determined the nitrogen reduction potential based on the sewering that was completed, and the shellfish that Chuck has for in there, we meet it with the alternatives, and just by the sewering alone that was completed, on paper it meets it, so. Great Pond is the estuary that Falmouth is in the midst of right now. Has a significant nitrogen reduction requirement. When you look at the fertilizer credit, stormwater credit, sewering, which includes the T-Ticket Acapesket sewer area, both phase 1 and phase 2, which are on the planning table, and the contribution, there was a portion of Little Pond that was in the there was a portion of Little Pond sewer service area that was in the Great Pond watershed. That was about 1,000 kilograms. Even with that and the amount of shellfish Chuck thinks can go in there, we're still falling short. Part of that, in the South Coast CWMP, there was a lot of potential given to the PRB at Shorewood Drive, which we've discovered will not be as fruitful as we had hoped. But I've presented some other potential ideas for PRBs up at Coonamessett River. There's always an IA option there, but with PRBs we have no idea how much that could potentially remove. So there are ways to get there, but the other way would be additional sewering, which would be another 843 parcels. Moving to the east, Green Pond, we have about 4,500 kilograms there. So phase 2 of TASA accounts for about 2,800 kilograms of that, and we've got shellfish in there. We are also short on this one, but we also have a big question mark here about what the implementations at Mill Pond may do. So, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we put the detention pond in above Mill Pond, and now it has finally cycled for a year. We also have those teabag wood chip floating PRB that S-Mast is working on. We have preliminary data from that. I know that they're planning to put that PRB out again this year. That's part of a graduate student thesis. So we don't have concrete numbers on that. So depending how effective that is, we could be there with our alternatives. To reach it by sewering, it will require an additional almost 250 parcels from what's already planned in phase 2 of TASA. Bourne's Pond, the big implementation in Bourne's Pond is the inlet widening. And there's also consistently been discussion about sewering a portion of Fisherman's Cove. So that's this development up on the northwest side. That combined with Chuck's shellfish number would get us there if we sewer 183 of those parcels. To meet it with sewering, it would be the 183 plus another 170 to get you there for the DEP watershed permits scenario. So Wacoit is the other shared estuary, and Wacoit is extra special because it has 3 sentinel stations with 3 threshold concentrations that you need to meet, but the allocation that GHD did to determine what town is responsible for what portion is not parsed out by those sentinel stations, but more distinct regions. So for Childs River, based on those allocations, be it, I think Childs River ends up being like 99% Falmouth's responsibility, but there's a bunch of small sub-watersheds in there, so it's not a hard and fast, we're responsible for X percent. We're responsible for 4,132 kilograms in Childs River. So Childs River being this portion on the west. It has always been the plan in the CWMP to sewer Antler Shores as well as Seacoast Shores. It's the lower portion of Seacoast Shores that actually falls within any of the Childs River sub-watersheds. That does not get us there, so you can either achieve it by additional sewering or putting some IAs in there. Additional sewering would require another almost 100 parcels.
So I just want to check, so that's Eel River.
This is Childs River.
Mm-mm.
This is the Childs River watershed.
It's Eel River.
That's
Yep,
Childs
that
River.
one's Childs River.
And my little box is wrong. My numbers are right, my box is wrong.
Okay, nope, that's what I wanted to check on, thanks.
Thanks for catching that, Eric. You've lived here how many years?
That's right. I'm good at this.
All right, so Eel Pond, which is really this one that's covered in gray. So for Eel Pond, we've got our fertilizer and our stormwater credit. Sewering would be the other portion of Seacoast Shores. And Seapit, I guess that's flip-flopped for those, but the numbers are still right. And shellfish, we get there for Eel Pond. Without the shellfish, you'd need another 27 parcels. Quashnet. Quashnet requires 646 kilograms. There has not been much planning on any of these eastern portions for Wacoit. I looked at what was produced from the 300-foot boundary exercise, and along the Quashnet River, there are 66 parcels within that 300-foot boundary that could get you some nitrogen removal, but it only gets you halfway. So we have the potential for nitrogen trading with Mashpee and working out a plan, but that requires the IMA to be put in place and discussions with them.
Yeah, let me just throw in here, we have had conversations with Mashpee. We've actually jointly worked with GHD to allocate which town is responsible for what level of nitrogen removal. we actually have drafted up an intermunicipal agreement and offered it to Mashpee, and we're getting crickets back so far, but I think that they're having internal discussions on it at the moment, but we don't have an answer, but we certainly have reached out and reached forward to get something going with them.
Good evening, it is 5 o'clock, and the library will be closing today at 5:30 in half an hour. Please be aware if you are on a public computer that the computer shut down 10 minutes before we close. Therefore, they will be shutting down in 20 minutes at 5:20 p.m. Thank you for joining us at the library today, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow when we open at 10 a.m.
Okay, so the next area is Red Brook, and this is separated out without Hamilton Pond. And this again is one of the ways that GHD did their allocation. So looking at Red Brook itself, there's a very small portion that's kind of up here. This is part of the Hamilton Pond subwatershed. There are 31 parcels within the 300-foot boundary that could be fit for IAs if the 300-foot boundary goes forward, but we are a very small portion of the way to the TMDL. So again, nitrogen trading potentials with Mashpee. If we do it by sewering, it's 100 parcels, 99 parcels that need to be sewered. Hamblin Pond itself, so that's from about here, down here, as well as this peninsula down here. Along the pond, on the water course, there's about 34 IAs that could be done within the 300-foot boundary. Again, very low as far as meeting the TMDL. By sewering, 97 parcels. So, for Pleasant Bay, I showed you how they broke up their plan by the general categories. This is what Falmouth looks like, for what we have numbers assigned to. So if you were paying attention earlier on, you might remember that our total target is 42,902 kilograms of nitrogen. So our plan is short. Our plan is short because of several reasons. Because there's no formal plan for Salt Pond, which is about 1,100 kilograms, and then all the shortcomings on the Wapoit eastern end, as well as the minor shortfalls in both Great Pond and Green Pond. But this covers about 92% of the nitrogen load required for town.
Right, so the takeaway here is our nitrogen removal target is well over double what it is for the Pleasant Bay communities. As the one of the selectmen down there said when we went to visit him, I'm sure glad I don't live in Falmouth. Well, we're glad he doesn't too. But but we're going to deal with this, but it's a major undertaking and much larger than what they've had to face.
All right, so as Eric talked about, we had the two bookends. So on all of those scenarios, on the right was the DEP watershed permit scenario. So if we make up the difference past fertilizer and stormwater by sewering. So our total, again, almost 43,000 kilograms of nitrogen. We've already taken out, because of the Little Pond Sewer Service Project, 5,800 kilograms. So we still have 37,000 kilograms that need to physically come out. So here's where we start to get sticky with assumptions. We've had these discussions many a times about how to calculate the amount of nitrogen removed per parcel, per single family residence. It's a very fluid number because it's all based on water use, and every watershed is unique. Even within, when we looked at the 300-foot boundary, the water use there versus further up in the watershed is very different. You have a lot of seasonal properties versus year-round residents. So what we did was we looked at, GHD had determined this number for the South Coast estuaries. And we looked at that, and we kind of averaged that. So at least we have a launching point to start to begin to calculate something. So per parcel, this is not single-family home, this is per parcel, we're using an average of 4.8 kilograms of nitrogen per parcel. So the DEP in the watershed permit requirements is requiring 75% of the nitrogen load reduction achieved in 20 years. So to do the 75% by sewering alone would require almost 5,800 parcels to be connected to sewers. This does not account for multi-use parcels like Falmouth Court and Treetops. This is basically for the big, broad numbers. For that final 25% after that first 20 years, or whenever, another 1,900 parcels.
Now, some people might think, well, in their proposal, they're only asking you to remove 75% in 20 years. I think we're all looking at this and saying, by their own arithmetic, 75% doesn't get you to the TMDL, so it is highly unlikely that they would say, you've got to your 75%, now stop. No, it's much more likely that they would say, well, now you got to keep going to get to 100%. So we've worked on that assumption that 100% is what they're going to want.
Plus build out, because they're gonna turn around and say, did you account for build out?
Oh, well, there's that too.
Right.
Anyway, if you don't have an adding machine, we're talking about 7,720 sewer parcels to be hooked up to the sewer to reach the TMDLs by sewering.
So then we played with some costs. And the fairest way to look at costs was basically for the collection system alone. There's a lot of things that are not included in this cost estimate. So the most recent cost estimate for the T-Ticket Acapesket sewer area for phase 1 comes out to about $37,000 per dwelling unit. So in 2022 dollars, GHD's estimate for the collection system is $23 million. You divide that by the 800 dwelling units, and you're at almost $29,000. Then the homeowner has the cost for the actual connection. For the Little Pond Sewer Service area, it was ranged between $4,000 and $6,000. Mashpee has a nice little document posted for its residents who are all going through this soon. And they cited that Chatham, who was one of the more recent ones, their average was about $8,000 per connection. So we used the 8,000 number, so we're getting about 36,700 per connection. So again, looking at the 75% target, that's the 5,790 parcels, is $208 million in 2022 dollars. Carrying that out for midpoint of the permit, it's a 20-year permit, so with 3% compounding interest accrued annually, you're up at $280 million in 2032 dollars. So after 20 years, if you go after that remaining 25%, so that 1,930 parcels, carrying out your $36,700 to 2042 dollars, you end up with an additional $128 million.
And for those of you who don't have a calculator, the total of those two numbers is $408 million. And again, this is only collection system. This is just the little pipes that go around the neighborhood and hook up to the neighbors. It is not all the other paraphernalia that goes into a sewer system. It's not treatment plant, it's not lift stations, it's not land acquisition, it's not anything but collection system.
So the Falmouth plan, so this is the left side of all of those watershed scenarios. Looking at it in total, Falmouth is planning to address 58% of the nitrogen reduction requirement through sewering. 22% we're calling hard alternative credits, so tangible implementation like inlet widening, things in the ground, things in the water, IA's aquaculture. 12% is your fertilizer and your stormwater credit for the bylaw and the updates. And then 8% to be determined, that's salt pond and the nitrogen treating. So if we look at that 58% sewering, that comes out to almost 19,000 kilograms is what has been baked into those plans. And you use the same removal per parcel, the 4.8 kilograms, you get 3,952 parcels, same 2022 valuation, and it would be 145 million. Halfway at midpoint of the permit, 195 million. So as Eric just briefly mentioned, there are many additional costs that are not included in that collection system cost estimate. That is only the collection system cost. All of the paperwork, the preparation of the watershed permit applications and getting the reports up to the approved plans to apply for those, the cost of the actual monitoring and reporting to DEP on all 14 estuaries, preparing another CWMP for the estuaries not currently covered, and TWMPs as we go along, force mains, lift stations, site acquisitions, discharge via land-based or outfalls, future upgrades to the treatment plant and expansion. Depending on how the discharge goes, if you're using a land-based discharge, there's going to be additional sewering that's going to need to be required, or additional nitrogen removal to offset nitrogen from those land-based sites, the Allen parcel or the Augusta, $2 that range. Currently, the only finance the town receives for wastewater infrastructure are the 0% as state revolving fund. To change. Low interest loans for homeowners for connecting to the sewer system. And then just a general point is that this watershed permit proposal is the largest wastewater project in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Water Resources Authority was created in the 1980s. The MWRA was subsidized by state and federal grants. This current proposal by DEP includes no additional subsidy to Cape Towns for implementation. So that's all of it in a nutshell. For anyone who is not familiar or wants to know where the most current planning documents are, they are available on the town's website. We have the South Coast CWMP, which includes South Coast estuaries and West Falmouth. And that update, the most recent update, was done in 2019. And then the Great Pond Targeted Watershed Management Plan, which we just got the Secretary's certificate for at the beginning of this year.
Okay, you've just had the tour of the waterfront, as it were, and you've seen all of our estuaries, and you've seen all of their problems. But I think our problem is paying for all this, and the folks who are going to have to figure that one out are mostly in the room here, so I hope we can have a little conversation. I know you've been having nothing but conversations about financing lately, but these numbers sort of put a point to it. I mean, the worst case scenario for the collection system alone is $400 million. The best case scenario is $200 million. So best case is none too good. and that, as we keep noting, leaves out plant upgrades, lift stations, all the assorted paraphernalia that aren't related directly to somebody's house. So we're talking about an enormous amount of money here. And to the extent there's been pushback to the DEP on this, Falmouth has been very good at pushing back. Barnstable has, Yarmouth has definitely, Mashpee, Dartmouth. There's been a fair number of towns who've looked at these kind of numbers and said, this is not feasible with this plan. They all agree, if you're going to do something with the estuaries, you will need more than 20 years to make it happen. I think they all agree you cannot do it without a substantial increase in federal and state financial contribution. And most of them are all saying, to the extent we have produced plans, CWMPs and TWMPs, we should be able to rely on them moving forward and not have to junk them and start fresh with a watershed permit for 14 estuaries. So those seem to be the talking points for the municipalities that are gravely affected. The input, conversation, I've talked enough. What do you think? Committee?
Hi, Doug Brown from the Select Board. So several years ago, we tried to look into alternatives, and we tried to find any people that would be willing to consider composting toilets. And at the time, you know, we had a few people that took an interest, but not much happened with it, and we determined it wasn't really practical to expect people to do that. But I wonder if we could reconsider re-looking at that issue with urine diverting toilets, which would be still a flush toilet. So it wouldn't look that different from what people use today. You just have a little receptacle in the front. And I think that people would be very encouraged to use it, even if you could only get one on the first floor, because they know that if it doesn't work and the whole thing's not panning out, we're going to have to spend $37,000 or $40,000 per house. So there's a massive incentive for people to try to live with it. And I don't think it would be that much of an inconvenience, so I hope we could consider, you know, looking at that again, even though it might not really work out. I'd like to at least look at it.
Well, I know you actually got down in the weeds in people's bathrooms and looked at it. And the town ran a major controlled experiment on this 10 years ago. We sent a mailing out to 22,000 households saying, we will give you $5,000 if you will do one of these alternative toilets in your house. We got 155 people who came back and said, yeah, I'd be interested. And we sent out people like Doug and other professionals to go see what the feasibility was, because there are issues of where the pipes can and can't go, how flat the floor is, a lot of issues. 155 people took that step. 9 of them actually put an IA in. And the other incentive we gave them was, if you're in the Little Pond Sewer Service area and you put one in, we won't charge you a betterment. Which that was a $14,000 incentive in addition to the $5,000 incentive. So they had plenty of financial incentives. 9 of them put them in. 2 of them have since pulled them out for aesthetic and other reasons. And the real problem we found with why people didn't take the last step was resale value. They had a very serious concern that if they were going to ever sell their house, the number of people who would want to buy it with these kind of installations would be diminished hugely, and that just scared them off. The other problem, if you could get a whole neighborhood to do it, you would be somewhere. If it's just individuals in an area that you're going to have to sewer anyway, all you're doing is raising the betterment costs for all the people who don't put them in, because you still have to run the pipes down the street for everyone who isn't putting them in. So there's sort of those 2 issues that I think have made it, from this committee's point of view, impractical to pursue. Any other? Yeah, sure.
So the other thing I wanted to mention was that it seems that the DEP doesn't really have a way to force homeowners. Maybe there is. I don't know what it is. But right now, all they can do is tell us, you got to change to IEA systems. But a homeowner may or may not do that right away. They may wait, get taken to court. Who knows how successful they'll be. And I think DEP is counting on us to take the lead and protect our residents by taking these watershed permits. But the way it's written right now, they're voluntary. So we don't really have to do it unless we decide we want to do it, because we see our residents in distress. But what if we were to try to negotiate with DEP and say, maybe we can partner with Mashpee and Bourne and do, you know, Wacoit Bay and Megansett, which are 2 outlying, you know, very difficult challenges. But maybe that would be an approach where we could start to negotiate with them and say, this is what we could possibly do, and maybe accelerate our timeline on the regular sewering, but not change the whole plan. And then maybe they would be a little bit more receptive. And the other thing about Wacoit and Megansett, both of them have been identified by the Water Quality Management, by the Waterways Committee, that, like for instance, Megansett is so silted up, boats can't even get in and out of there, and a lot of sailboats have had to leave and go to other places. And there's like 45,000 yards of unsuitable material that need to go out of there. And maybe we would get credit for some flushing in that area, and that Wacoit Bay is becoming the same way. The main channel is getting filled in with silt. I don't remember the number there, but it's much higher than Megansett. So those are my only other ideas.
Now, Peter?
Peter Johnson, Staub, interim town manager. Just sort of a number for perspective. Ed Centeo and I have been just in the last couple of weeks really digging in, mostly Ed really, in looking at what our borrowing capacity is without increasing taxes. And rough order of magnitude, and these are very rough forecasts that have many, many assumptions built into them. We're going to be actually presenting on this and talking about it in some detail at the select board meeting tonight. But we're looking on the order of $200 million in borrowing capacity within the next 16 years. So that's for everything. And what you've just described doubles that, and that assumes there's nothing else going on in the town of Falmouth.
Exactly. No, it's a major dilemma. The enterprise.
Hi. I'm just wondering, I was here for the League of Women Voters panel about this topic, and Andrew Gottlieb talked a lot about various funding, sort of state, I guess, and federal grant options and various applications for things. And I was just wondering how that, those options factor into the financial piece of this.
He did speak glowingly about all the federal money that was floating around. As we're watching it float, $41 million of it floated over to the county, and $1.5 million has come back to the town of Falmouth out of that pot. Quite a lot floated up to the legislature, and they dispensed quite a lot of it, but none of it came back to the towns in Cape Cod for water quality improvements. That's as far as it's gotten. The legislature has several billion left to dispense, and I think the Cape communities that are most affected here are going to be lobbying very hard to say, if you expect us to do anything like this, you had better send a lot of that our way. But so far, that hasn't happened. So yeah, I think Peter just summarized it nicely, that it would gobble all of the borrowing capacity we have without raising taxes, and we would need twice that much, and we would be able to spend money on nothing else for the next 16 to 20 years. That's not the scenario we can live with. Steve?
To what extent do you think there's still any room to bargain with DEP? And the reason I ask that is, it's my sense that there are two parts to their demand. One is that you will do it in 20 years. The other part is that you will definitely do it. And that second part, I submit, is real and is important to the psychology of the Conservation Law Foundation and all those people, that they see us as malingering over the last 30 or 40 years. It doesn't matter whether we were or not. They perceive that. And you sort of have to admit that in one sense we have, because we're saying, gee, they're going to force us to actually do this. This is real. Well, contracts in business are real. If you don't fulfill them, you don't get paid. And so I submit they care more about that than they do about the actual number of years. That, for instance, this is just my guess, that there will be some chance to negotiate for, say, 40 years or maybe more, but you really agree to do it. So they see that we're really in good faith, but we say we can't be in good faith for a ridiculously short period of years because numbers don't lie. That's all I want to say.
Sure. So far, they have not been doing any negotiating, but I think they've been getting a lot of feedback. In fact, they've been getting bowled over by the feedback. And I think they're sort of panicking now and thinking they'd better come up with a better scenario than this. And I'm not privy to any of that, but there's been enough feedback. 2 senators have filed bills basically telling them they can't do this until the state and the feds come up with a lot more money. There's been legislative feedback. There's been a lot of feedback from the towns that are in the same situation. So the time frame is that they have now ended their comment period, and they now have to answer the comments, and then they have to do something. We have a new administration, which is not married to, I mean, the old administration was hoping to put this in place before they left in January 3rd, and they didn't do that. So the new administration now has time to revisit it, put their people in, and hopefully come up with something that works better for the Cape and the islands.
Eric,
Yeah, Tom, you're on.
is it on? Oh, okay. I don't want to add bad news, but I haven't seen any good estimates of what 20 years of build-out would add to the numbers that we've been modeling forever now. Do you know what they are? Has anyone seen new numbers?
No, we haven't done that. It's a project, and
Yeah.
we haven't. Because the other point is, if 15 Cape towns and a few others are all trying to do the same thing in 20 years, you'll find the very few contractors who are good at this will be hard to get and very expensive. So the cost estimate going up 3% a year is probably wishful thinking.
Do you think we could ask the Cape Cod Commission for them to get going on this so that we have some new base?
That's a fair question. Kristen, does the Cape Cod Commission have a tool so you could easily calculate what the build-out has been since these dates were, the original dates were created?
I've never seen a tool for build-out. I'm sure that's something that GIS could potentially do, because it's all based on land use codes and what the current land use
Yeah.
codes are.
Yeah.
So that could be something I could work with Falmouth GIS.
Sure.
Careful what you.
Eric, can I?
Yeah, I was gonna say, what-
Ask the Cape Cod Commission for that, they'll be happy to spend $5 million to write the tool.
Right, right. And whatever number they come up with is gonna just make our problem worse.
Eric, one point on build-out is, we have this pressure for affordable housing. If we add 3 market rate units for every affordable unit, build-out is astronomical. We're going to add 10,000 homes to Falmouth. So I think there's 2 conflicting state mandates here. One is DEP wants us to clean up these estuaries, reduce nitrogen inputs, and yet we see a proposal for somewhere between 300 and 900 units in the Coonamessett River watershed that will totally undo the next phase of sewering that's planned. So, somehow those need to be resolved.
Well, the one good thing about the new administration, they seem really willing to listen. We went to the Mass Municipal Association annual meeting, and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll was good enough to spend at least a half an hour with us, listening to all the comments and the Cape Town representatives really did a good job of explaining the situation that we're in, and I think she was writing down notes. She seemed very interested and concerned about what we were explaining to her. So.
Good. Good. Any other comments or questions from Betty or anybody else? We wanted to kind of paint the picture so that everybody gets it, because it's basically the biggest issue that is facing this town ever, financially ever.
Yeah, I guess this is sort of a follow-up on Steve's comment in terms of negotiating with the DEP. If the regulations are in fact approved in their current form, and hopefully they won't be, but if they are, the town's going to be faced with some really interesting decisions, because we've got several bad options. One would be to dive in on the watershed permits so that we save the individual homeowners from having to put in IAs that don't solve the problem. On the other hand, another alternative would be to not do that, because it's not going to be the town of Falmouth that's going to go knocking on anyone's door and say you have to put in an IA. I don't believe that, you know, we're the enforcement agent there. The enforcement agent is the state, and I think they'd have a tough time enforcing it. I mean, that's going to be a political nightmare for the governor, whatever the administration is at the time, to say, sorry, you're going to need to spend $40,000 to address a water quality problem that this doesn't actually address.
Absolutely. I think they've already learned that that option is toxic, that nobody can see any sense to it. So that's helpful in a way.
That's a good point. And also, it would be even harder for them to make that case if we had a 40 or 60-year plan to do it a different way. Because then the homeowner could say, you've got me caught, that will beat your suit. Literally.
Yeah. Yeah, this 20-year thing, it was kind of plucked out of the sky, or more realistically, plucked out of the lawsuit that Conservation Law Foundation filed against Barnstable, Mashpee, and DEP. It's not based on anything more than a number that they would like, but you know, there's nothing more to it. So that certainly should be a negotiable item.
Well, Eric, as you pointed out, most of the towns have one or two estuaries that, so 20 years maybe is a reasonable time frame in that context, but not for Falmouth.
Yeah, it's Falmouth, Barnstable, Mashpee, and Yarmouth, and Dartmouth that are really affected. Madam Chairman.
So I have a question and a point. To speak to Mr. Foreman, 15 towns are impacted by these regulations, is that correct?
Plus the islands, plus a bunch over on the south coast.
And how many of those communities have 14 estuaries? So when DEP came up with this, it seemed to me that it was painted with a very broad brush. And so that would be a question, number one. Number two, to Mr. Johnson-Staub's point, who are the enforcers? And what happens if Falmouth doesn't do it?
Very good question.
I wanted to just point out, it looks to me that there are 4 estuaries on the west side that we're already proposing to put IAs in anyway, right? That's the bylaw we've been talking about. Yes? So we're already talking about that for those 4 estuaries. Then for the other 10, I guess, on the south side, most of those we are also already proposing some sort of sewering. So the only thing that this changes is the rate at which we do it and the paperwork required. Is that correct?
The watersheds go all the way up. We're only talking about doing the estuaries immediately around the estuaries, but eventually we have to go into all the upper areas of the watersheds as well. So I think that's what DEP is talking about now, is fixing the whole watershed in a hurry, where we've always said that we'll get to that someday.
So I guess I'm saying, we keep saying it's 14 estuaries, but I don't think it is. It's only the south side ones that we're gonna have to figure out watershed permits for. I feel like the other ones, we can have IA systems, and it kind of sounds to me like we don't, in order to meet TMDLs, the whole watershed doesn't need an IA. So if we went to DEP and we said, we don't think the whole watershed needs this, we think this number of parcels will do it, I imagine DEP would be okay with that.
Well, you could probably clarify that.
So the way the regulations have been proposed is that an entire impaired watershed, every parcel has to put an IA in. That is the mandate. If you don't want to do that, if you only want to cherry pick which parcels get an IA, it has to be done under a watershed permit. That's how you say we can meet the TMDL only doing 20 IAs.
But the watershed permit doesn't require sewering. So the 4
Correct.
estuaries where there was a bylaw for IA systems, that could be a watershed.
Proposed bylaw.
Right. I'm just saying, like, this isn't reinventing the wheel. It's just making, it's enforceable, right? You point that out a lot. And the rate at which we have to do it and the expense. So I feel like we need to reframe this in a way that's more productive for the town and for, our next steps. Because if we can talk to DEP about, obviously we need to know what they're actually gonna, legislate. But I get a little nervous where we start getting ahead of ourselves. I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves, I guess is my point.
Fair enough, yeah.
It does seem like the other issue that DEP needs to address is what's an acceptable on-site alternative system, right? Their regulations right now make it impractical to even implement their own solution.
Exactly right, yeah. Steve?
I like Jordan's point, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I'm about to say is another way of saying that. That this presentation emphasized the bookends, which is totally reasonable for a first pass. But that admits that there are a lot of books in between the bookends. Their intermediate plan. You're pointing out that it's not that we do all of Falmouth with sewers or all of Falmouth with
Or that we
IA.
even have to change the plan that we've put forth
Right.
beforehand, yeah.
The ideal plan is actually, in fact,
Yeah.
IAs in some places and sewers in other places.
Part of the objective of rehashing all of the watersheds was for all of the members, because we've had turnover, to be on the same page, and for everyone who has the interest to say, there is a plan that has been discussed, here's the current iteration of it. The ones for Buzzards Bay Estuary have not been submitted for state approval, but it's what's been worked out and discussed so that nobody thinks the town is not looking at their watershed as well.
Right.
Yes, Amy?
Hi. I really appreciate the work that you, Kristen, with ScienceWares and the Water Quality Management Committee have done to quantify all of this. It's not the town's official plan. It is not the, necessarily the path forward, but it's a starting point to envision the scale of the work that needs to be done either under the town's plan or under the DEP's plan. It's an enormous amount of work, and I think you've come up with a very helpful way of quantifying the load removals, the number of properties to be sewered, and a preliminary estimate of a portion of the cost. It's very helpful in envisioning the process to move forward if these regulations if the regulations are implemented, and even without that. As Jordan's saying, there is a version in this presentation of what the town's vision would be without the regulations, and that still is an enormous amount of work, and you've got a nice summary of that for us, and I appreciate that.
John Waterbury, one of the things that I'm not clear about is what the state is actually thinking about with their 20-year timeline. Are they saying to us, you need to propose something and have accomplished putting in the infrastructure in 20 years? Or are they saying in 20 years, you're going to have to meet the TMDLs in your watersheds? And those are very, very different timelines. And, just our experience in West Falmouth Harbor, we upgraded our West Falmouth treatment plant in 2005, and we thought in 7 years we'd be able to see the impact of that on West Falmouth Harbor, and we're just beginning to see it now. So that even if we were to buy into this 20-year plan and we went and built all this stuff, it will be many, many years after that's completed before we'll actually achieve the TMDLs. There's a huge amount of hysteresis in these ponds, in the sediments. So somehow DEP has got to think through what's actually implied by these timelines they're envisioning.
Yes, when you talk about reducing the nitrogen load, you're reducing the part that comes from home septic systems. None of them are claiming that will now clarify it and make your water pure and the fish will all come back. All they're saying is it will stop making it worse, essentially. And that hopefully at some point things after that would get better. But all you're doing is stopping the bleeding. You haven't cured the patient.
The final thought would be, I'd love to see us think about dredging as an environmental improvement as well, because that could lead to some immediate results. You know, all that decomposing stuff that's just sitting there, I'd love to see that gone. Just, you know, it would make things nicer for people that live there too.
That is the one experiment that this committee hasn't pursued, which is to dredge black muck. And I know the town does it at Oyster Pond and maybe some other places, but
Well, they don't dredge the pond.
but they take the black muck out, right?
But also
One
dredging
little
to
part.
improve flushing.
Yeah, but it's an experiment worth pursuing.
We
Is
did have numbers on that, though, from somebody. There, people like Brian House and so on, and can do back-of-the-envelope calculations on how much nitrogen is coming in now from the muck, and therefore, in the ideal world, how much wouldn't be coming in if you took the muck away. I don't know the numbers, but somebody does. So you don't have to
Yeah.
actually.
I think we ran into a roadblock of sorts on the idea that the Conservation Commission might not be too keen on letting you go in there and stir up all the muck.
One of the other issues with that was identifying specifically where in the estuary the muck was. And with all of the work that Chuck and MES did with the shellfish surveys, they actually characterized the bottom in a lot of those areas. So that's additional information that could be used to pursue that, should that be something that's decided on.
Eric, could I?
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry, Matt. You haven't-
So yeah, I have real mixed feelings about this, proposed 20-year time frame. On the one hand, I would love to see improvements to our estuaries within my lifetime and my kids' lifetime. On the other hand, I don't want my taxes to go through the roof. So I think we should keep an open mind about moving along sooner than later on the hope and the likelihood, I would think, that there will be some federal and state money that would come through for this if it were to be, actually mandated.
Okay, Amy.
I just wanted to address the issue that comes up frequently in the newspaper and in public meetings about this, which is people raise frequently the concept of alternatives to sewering and how we should really look at those. And you all have looked at them in great detail over time, but the message that we keep needing to get out again is that the nitrogen load removal that's required in order to meet the water quality limits for the watersheds is so high. We need to remove so much nitrogen load that we cannot do that in most of these watersheds with anything but sewering. Additional things can also help within those watersheds. So a lot of times it's presented as an either or. We shouldn't be doing sewering, we should just do alternatives. We have to do both, or some kinds of alternatives in addition to sewering in order to meet the goals. So there is a place for composting toilets if homeowners are interested in them. In the upper watersheds, if people are interested in putting in composting toilets, then that will help the area. That will be an improvement. But that's not the solution in much of Falmouth. And the same with many of the alternatives that have been raised. They're wonderful concepts, and they would be helpful in portions of the watershed, but they are not a viable alternative to sewering in order to meet the load limits for the ponds.
Amy is right. This committee was established as a reaction to a proposal that everything be sewered. And the town meeting said, we want to hear about all the alternatives, and we want somebody to really look at them in great depth. And for the last 10 years, that's exactly what this committee has been doing. So we probably know, we, the town of Falmouth, probably know as much about alternatives and how useful they are as anybody in the state of Massachusetts. And our conclusion is essentially what you have said. On the West Coast, we have low load targets we can actually address in several of those estuaries without sewering. On the South Coast, the numbers are so high, all the alternatives in the world aren't going to get you there. And that's essentially been the Falmouth plan, that we'll do the sewering where you have to, and the rest, any place we can that saves us from sewering.
I just had a question, another question, about funding. So I understand, obviously, various reasons why you'd want to not raise taxes. Has anyone, and this is going to be really vague, but like, has anyone done any kind of like calculation or research into like how much taxes, like the option of raising taxes? And if so, I would love to hear more about that.
Well, I bet there are two people in the room that have, and I bet they don't want to talk about it.
So we have, we're just beginning to put numbers on what would the DEP regulations cost. And these are still this is excellent work, but it's very rough numbers. I mean, we've been talking about the numbers that were identified here were just the collection system and then some additional factors. So no is the answer to your question. We have not specifically identified a tax impact to implement these regulations. We would need to do some additional work on costing before we could get there. But it's certainly something that we could take a look at. And while I have the microphone, I guess I just want to follow up on Mr. Charette's point that just to reiterate that, certainly from my perspective, I'm not suggesting, that we don't want to do watershed permits, right? I'm not suggesting that this is, I think there's a strong consensus in the community that we want to take action to clean up our estuaries. And in our ideal world, the state would be saying, we'll pay 3/4 of the cost, and then maybe, we could look at a 20-year horizon to put the infrastructure in place that puts us on a path to achieve the nitrogen reduction, to John Waterbury's point. Not that we're going to actually remove the nitrogen from all the estuaries in 20 years, but yeah, we're saying the proposed regulations as submitted without a counterpart of here's a real funding commitment from the state or federal government, raises all kinds of alarms for us in terms of the tax burden.
Yeah, the financial brains are here, but I just, as one who reads the Enterprise, I see the town is considering trying to raise roughly $1 million a year with an override, and the estimate is that it would be $45 to $50 additional on the tax rate for whatever, 20 years, or however many years. Well, in that case, it would go forever. But the ratio of, if $50 on your tax bill buys $1 million a year, $1 million, you can go to the state revolving fund and borrow $20 million, and you pay it back in the next 20 years. So that buys you $20 million. Or 400. Right. No,
I think 400 is in there.
Precisely. So it gets bigger fast. And that's worth avoiding. Well, if you have a watershed permit and it's an enforceable permit, the voters can say no, and I don't know what happens after that. But enforcement means, as Amy knows, with the plant, when DEP has permitting power and enforcement power, they can tell you to do very expensive things. And they don't really care if your town meeting and your voters don't like it. Yeah, the watershed permits would be mandatory, yeah, so that's part of the dilemma. So, well, some of you have meetings to go to, and you probably would like to have some dinner. We'll do a little housekeeping, but I thank you so much for coming. Your expertise obviously is going to be tested in the next few months, but I'm very glad you came. Okay, do we have any other things besides the minutes? Reports of members and staff.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a tiny item of what I think is interesting and good news. Our Shellfish Advisory Committee met last Wednesday, and Dan Ward, who's one of our contractors for the Eel River project, sort of on the side, has been growing some scallops there, partly to see, and they're a very different animal, of course, from oysters or quahogs in terms of what they want to do and the conditions they want and all. But he set a few aside to do their nitrogen content, and the scallop holds about 1.5 times what a mature oyster holds, which is a good start.
Yeah.
And the really neat thing is the scallops can do this in 5 months instead of the 1.5 years that it takes us to do an oyster, or the almost 3 years it takes to do a quahog. So that part is really good. These are all kind of these very small sample sizes and stuff. But the content numbers that he got indicate that 1 million scallops would sequester 450 kilograms of nitrogen. And again, he and I were throwing a lot of numbers back and forth, but under reasonable conditions, they could probably have 1 million scallops grown in 5 months in about 1.5 acres area. We were playing with different experimental layouts because the gear and all is quite different from what we're growing oysters in there now. So that would be 1.5 acres area, multi-layers deep though. So you need a little bit deeper water. But so that 1.5 acres would sequester 450 kilograms. Our present 1.5 acres of oysters sequesters about 200 kilograms. So you get 2.5 times oyster and a much faster time scale too. But as he has pointed out, because he's in the business of growing lots of scallops, you could have 100 times as many seed scallops in the same area and then release them in the proper places in town. Then you run into the issue of black boxing it. The nice thing with our oysters right now is we know exactly the nitrogen content that goes into the system, and because of the way we've got the system set up, we know exactly how much nitrogen comes out when the oysters are harvested and sold. Scallops, you're not going to have 100% survival, obviously, of the small scallops, but you would have to, hopefully in a fine system, have a commercial scallop fishery again like we had for many, many years in Falmouth, and then you would be monitoring the commercial scallopers catch and seeing how much nitrogen comes out that way. But it's a really interesting spin on moving away from, right now, I can't say all, but 2/3 or 3/4 of our eggs are in one basket. It's in oysters. And we could have a horrible outbreak of something and lose all our oysters at once. But anyway, I thought it was really interesting news, and it's all very, very preliminary, and I just thought the committee would like to think.
That sounds great. Is it politically acceptable to the oystermen and the scallopers?
That's where it gets really dicey. I don't want to get into the politics of it right now, but the big shift, all of the money from growing oysters, which is this year was close to $60,000. I can't do the math in my head, but it's over $19,000 per year coming back from the growers times 3, is all going to buy seed clams, seed quahogs, to be put out for mostly commercial harvest, some for recreational harvest. And again, I don't want to get into the politics under it, but our Shellfish Department is under a lot of pressure to put out seed cohogs, and we've got 51 licensed shellfishermen in town right now, and probably a quarter of them are doing it full-time. The others, it's almost casual, like a hobby or something, or when they're short of money or something along that line.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, it's certainly interesting, and Falmouth, you know, has suffered for years. Any of you that have been here for a while know that not that long ago, we used to have some phenomenal scallop harvesting in
Yes.
West Falmouth Harbor and in McCoy Bay. This year, spectacular numbers from Martha's Vineyard, and I think almost as good numbers from Nantucket, but I haven't actually seen articles about the Nantucket harvest. So it can be done right here, close by. I mean,
The same people do both? Steve, are the same people willing to do both?
Yes, there are, interesting you should raise that, because there are some of the commercial licenses, and this is from talking to Chuck about it and trying to figure out how many licenses to have in town and all. There are commercial license holders that fish the first week of the scallop season, and that's pretty much it for the year. That's anecdotal coming from Chuck to me and a couple other people that have asked about this setup.
My wife was reading an article on companion planting in the garden, and which is apparently an old technique, and I guess some farmers use it too. The more variety you have,
Right.
the more disease resistant you are.
Right.
And all kinds of predators, because the predators can't find it. You know, if there's no big target that says. come.
Exactly. You want to get away from a monoculture
Right.
and have a diverse thing. One of the things that's happening right now, Matt Weeks, he's probably the most successful of our growers right now. He was 45% above this year's targets in terms of production. He's got 400 feet of line out right now seeded with kelp, with the idea that kelp growth and harvest here is primarily a cold weather wintertime activity, and that would provide a nice balance against the physical effort of going into the shell fishing, which is a spring through December 1st sort of activity. But right now, there doesn't seem to be much market. Matt, you might know better. There's not much market right now for kelp in variety of forms.
I remember when Waquoit Bay and West Falmouth Harbor were good scallop areas.
Oh, yeah.
Are they now? I mean, are
No.
there any areas in town that are now?
I did not go, well, let me get real anecdotal myself, because, you know, young starving graduate students can do almost anything, and I could get my limit scallops in 45 minutes in West Falmouth Harbor in a few select spots. It took much longer to shuck them than it did to collect them, but I'd heard not this past fall, but 15 months ago, that there was a pretty good set of scallops in West Falmouth Harbor, and I got my gear together and I looked at my notes, and it had been 10 years since I had scalloped in West Falmouth Harbor, and I went over with someone else, and something over an hour and a half, I got 11 scallops, and the woman that was with me, I think, got 3.
Yeah, okay. So it's not happening.
and I knew where to look,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, it's an interesting idea, and I just wanted to bring it up because it has some implications for what we're trying to do over there.
Sure.
I had 4 technical questions. I can go through them really fast.
You don't have to stay for this, by the way. I mean, she should get something to eat before she goes to see the selectmen again.
On
Thank you for coming.
See you, Amy. Take care.
On Kristen's presentation, and we don't have to get the answers now, but, and you can all tell me that they're stupid questions, but one is, and yeah, we don't have to give the answer now. Explain what nitrogen trading is, because it's got to be different than carbon trading, because it's got to be in a certain place. Because carbon trading can be anywhere in the world. It's all makes sense. And the back of the envelope calculation, in your wildest dreams, the amount of nitrogen you could take out of Mill Pond, if that works perfectly, what would it be to Green Pond? And in Falmouth Harbor, the red area is way up at the head of the harbor, as it is on a lot of the estuaries, and this applies to some other estuaries too. What is feeding in up there? And will the sewers down closer to the Vineyard Sound do anywhere near as much good as getting rid of whatever is pouring it in at the top? And the last one is, Steve Rafferty brought up years ago, the idea of a percent discount, so to speak, on the nitrogen return on shellfish, so that someone can't object, well, hey, every 5th year, you get wiped out by disease. So instead, you just ask for 80% of credit.
You could be pretty sure DEP would think of that right away. That they're not gonna give you 100% when they know.
But
everyone's-
it keeps them from saying, well, you can't do it at all, because
Right.
one year you might get wiped out.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all.
And, which brings up one question I meant to ask. Well, I've forgotten, what was the total cost for the little pond per parcel cost of that?
Oh, okay, well, the betterment turned out to be about $14,000.
Right.
Which is 70% of the cost of the collection system, so.
Right, so I was thinking around 20,000 per parcel.
Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah,
I couldn't remember what the actual number was, but 20 was,
yeah, that seems right, yeah.
okay, good. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't way off base on
I
that.
think it's more than that.
The actual cost?
Yeah.
Well, a collection
Ken
system.
and I had this argument, what,
So
a
the
couple
whole
weeks
project
ago?
was what? It was about $40 million, right?
Okay, but that included some lift stations. it included
Yeah.
Some pipes to here, there, and everywhere. It included some other stuff. So the actual.
Are you asking what's the cost per household, or what does a household have to
Well, I
pay?
guess for the whole system, because there's no point in having a collection system if you can't move it to where it needs to be treated.
Who paid for what?
It's not who, yeah, I
Yeah.
think he's not asking that.
Right.
What the- He's
Oh.
asking what did it cost per house?
Right.
To do the project.
Okay.
Isn't it slide 31?
And my recollection was, when all was said and done, it was about $44 million, or 1,400 or so.
Yeah,
That's the number I remember, so that would come in at what, Ken? What
Isn't
is-
this on
Divided
Kristen's
by
slide number 31?
1,400,
That's just the collection system.
30,000.
30, okay. Because, see, the new numbers are coming in at 64, and then I've seen numbers for Barnstable, they're way over 100,000 per household, some of the estimates I've seen there, and I'm just trying to,
Well,
Kristen,
depend-
you're saying that was just the collection system?
On my presentation,
Right.
yes. But your number that you're at includes the lift station, includes force mains, it includes
Does it include the connection?
per house?
Yeah,
That I don't know,
I'm not sure it does.
because that would be another
Or,
4,000 to 6,000 per house
Yeah.
times your 1,400.
then you're up to 35,000.
Yeah, it's not gonna be any less.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
was
Can I
wondering
ask a
if-
question about the
Kristen,
presentation?
In your presentation, you didn't talk about what to do with all that water
Oh, what water?
that we collected.
The discharge site?
Yes.
Well,
I said it wasn't included in the cost
Yeah,
of
you did say
land-based
that.
or
So that
outfall.
might add, if you did
Yep.
the outfall option,
Oh.
another 50 to 100 million, right?
yep,
100 million.
yeah, there'll be a number, but it'll be big.
Yeah.
And land-based, so there'll be a number.
Jordan, I think, has,
Oh, I just had a question about the presentation as well. So it says, we have 14 estuaries that we might have to address all at once. But when we went through, the Little Pond and West Falmouth are done?
On paper, but not stamped by the state, and they don't meet the threshold concentration at the Sentinel station. So,
That's an interesting question, because I'm concerned that some of these, we may do everything right. We may see the inputs fall to the level they're supposed to fall to. We may have time go by, and maybe they'll never meet it because of the flushing characteristics or the flow characteristics in the estuaries.
Or climate change?
and release from the sediment.
All the things you
Yeah, the
pointed out.
sediment release, but I think.
Everything. No,
you
you're
know,
absolutely right.
I mean, in 5 years or so, things cleared up in Boston Harbor. That was a sludge dumping kind of problem, but.
Yeah. No, you're right. We could do all this
You know, it
See
could,
the-
it
see
could
nothing.
be that the MEP standard is flawed, I guess is what I'm,
I think that should be a very, very big concern, because
It is
I
blasphemy,
think,
but it's
I
absolutely
think we
true.
could go through every hoop set in front of us.
Yep.
And to give an example, the state commissioned a resurvey of West Falmouth Harbor in 2019 or 2020. I think the report came out in 2021, almost a year and a half ago. And they reported that of all the coastal embayments that have been studied, West Falmouth Harbor was the only one showing improvement. And they showed it expanded eelgrass coverage. And I went back and forth. I said, I would love for them to show me where that is, because when I was in there shortly after that sampling was done, it's a desert. It's a mess.
and it's showing improvement, but there hasn't been any significant reduction in the input. So
But everything all of you are saying is right, but where do you go from there?
I don't know.
There's no clear path forward. It's a
But, I mean,
mush.
you have to be careful, because if you let DEP, or the Conservation Law Foundation, hear you saying that, beep, 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 beep,
Well, that's why I
malingering,
didn't say
malingering,
it
they're kicking the
earlier.
can down the road.
Yeah, it is an answer that hasn't been broached in the public way,
Right.
but it's a fair question.
I mean, I think to some degree, these
you know-
systems are sort of naturally eutrophic systems,
Yeah.
especially because of the very restricted inlets.
Yes.
Yep. And I remember Brian Dudley we asked him this, what happens if we do all the sewering you want and the formula says we're gonna reach our target? And what happens if nothing happens at the Sentinel station? He says, keep sewering. You know, basically, that, they don't take into account the possibility of what you just described.
Well, Eric, these coastal ponds are trying to evolve to docks.
Yeah, exactly.
They've been doing that for centuries.
Yeah,
And if you look at Donbrook Harbor and Wellesley, the whole damn thing's filled in, they had to move to town, they picked their houses up, and they moved them to another place.
yeah.
So, you know, we all say, oh, I remember when I was a kid in 1947, the pond
We
looked
don't all
like
say
this.
that.
80 years later.
1947, I was a very small kid. I didn't see any ponds. But yeah,
Good.
The lagoon on Oyster Pond is like, and it's got flow through it. And Oyster Pond is one of the least, the nitrogen concentration is one of the least bad of the various estuaries. But, and that the lagoon is disgusting. I mean,
But that goes to your question of
solid,
why
dead
the upper
eelgrass.
regions of those, narrow, long bays are red. That's where
Due to dilution.
you've got
Or
Yeah.
lack.
nutrient-rich fresh water coming in, and
Yeah.
it takes a while for that stuff to flush out. So
yeah, the worst
residence time there
flushing,
is long enough that you get, in the upper part there, that you get some
the
accumulation.
worst flushing is up there. It's very shallow, and it's being loaded with nitrogen every day from the freshwater source.
Yeah, just look at Great Pond, right? Our old models, Brian's model, said that Coonamessett River at the head of Great Pond was 55% of the nitrogen loading. You look at Chris Neal's most recent numbers, real numbers measured in Coonamessett River, up and down the length of the river. I don't know how it would fit new stuff, but I would not be at all surprised if it was 75 to 80% of the nitrogen load of that system right now. It's way up there. And like I said, we're gonna sewer that whole northern perimeter, near shore basin around there. And my guess is, and we don't have any thin ice even to walk out on anymore, my guess is we're gonna have minimal effect on the pond itself.
Ken and I had a way to fix that for cheap. Concom wouldn't let us do it.
Which the sequential reactor beds?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
To clean
now,
up the river.
yeah, now there was talk of a long PRB, the length of the river.
That's my guess.
That would be,
Not pretty, not.
Any other reports from members or staff? Nope. Well, Kristen, you did a wonderful job.
Yes.
as usual.
Yep.
Except I mixed the headings up for Childs and Neil Pond.
Well, that was Eric's
Yeah.
fault.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
blame,
that was Eric's fault.
blame me. I wouldn't know which is which, but you.
I love that you were like, no, this is Child's River, and I was like, no,
I
it's
have
not.
to,
On my
Well,
side
I-
it was,
I have to admit that that's really my bailiwick, because one of my major dissertation sampling sites was in Childs River. And by then, I had looked at so many estuaries in the figure that by then I was just trying to run to stay ahead.
All right, hearing no more reports from members and staff, let's move on to the minutes. Any comment or questions or amendments to the minutes?
I rolled over a few very small rocks at low tide that I will discuss directly with you in just a minute. I would vote that we accept the minutes as
Accept them
presented.
as-
I would move, excuse me.
Moved and seconded to accept the minutes as presented. In discussion, all in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye, opposed, the ayes have it. Matt,
Motion to adjourn.
motion to adjourn.
Great.
Second.
Yes, all in favor,
All in
yes.
favor,
Seconded
aye,
and voted.
opposed, the ayes have it. Thank you very